Hello everyone. So a long time ago, I made a Reflux versus Igniter comparison video. But in that video, I didn't have a proper Igniter setup, so the comparison was pretty scuffed. So ever since then, I've been wanting to actually set up a proper Igniter build so that I could do a fair comparison. And recently, I actually had an opportunity to do that. So in this video, what I'd like to do is revisit that comparison video and do it again in a more fair way. And as well, we also have, full relic sets and we have more mature builds. So I think now is an interesting time to do this. One of the biggest debates you'll hear when it comes to Sorceress in Lost Ark is what's better, Reflux or Igniter? And I don't think anyone can deny that Igniter does more damage because it's the harder build to play. But what I wanted to see was by how much, right, in a fairly equalized setting. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the Igniter build. I'll do some tests, and then we'll take a look at the various Reflux builds. The instant cast, the piano, the casting, and all of that good stuff. So here I am running the most popular variant of Igniter, which is Specialization Swiftness. Most people don't have access to a high enough cooldown gem for Doomsday to comfortably Doomsday twice in the same, Igniter cycle. So I figure I'd use the more popular build here. And I am using 6 Nightmare, which is the standard Igniter setup as well. For the engravings, I'm using Grudge, Igniter, Hitmaster, All-Out Attack, and Precise Stagger. Precise Stagger is there because without it, we don't have any crit rate outside of Igniter, which is kind of sad. For the gems, nothing too crazy. You'll notice that I don't have any Frost Call gems, which is pretty standard for the build. That's just because I didn't have them on hand. It doesn't affect the actual cycle of the Igniter states too much in my personal testing, but take it with a grain of salt. And for the cards, I'm using the Lost Wind Cliff, which puts my crit rate at about 27%. For the skills, let's go ahead and take a look. Here's Blaze, just 221. For Esoteric Reaction, you will notice that I'm using Shockwave over Stabilized Crystal. In Igniter, you should be using Stabilized Crystal because it's easier to hit and both of them give you the same amount of identity gauge. It's just that I didn't have the tripod set up. So Shockwave will actually do more damage overall, so just know that the Esoteric Reaction damage in this test will be slightly inflated, I guess. But it's not a big part of Igniter DPS, so I don't think it's too bad. Here's Frost Call. This is just 321. There's Doomsday, 121. Explosion, you will notice that I am using Mind Enhancement. While using Nightmare and Igniter together, it's very important that when you're bursting, you are staying in the Magick Addiction state and not the Boundless MP state. So Mind Enhancement makes that a lot easier to do. Then we have Weak Point Detection and Magic Amplification. Same thing for Punishing Strike as well too. You can see that I'm using Mind Enhancement here and then Electric Discharge because it's the casting variant and Magic Amplification. For Rhyme Arrow, I decided to go with Quick Prep over Enlightenment just because at a certain level of specialization, it's actually more efficient to use Rhyme Arrow multiple times to generate more gauge. And with this setup, I can achieve just a standard, Igniter setup. And then Piercing Strike and Ice Pick. There are my runes on the side. I had a little bit of a debate whether to put the Legendary Wealth on Frost Call or Rhyme Arrow. I ended up going with Rhyme Arrow, but I know a lot of people do put it on, thing. In the end, for me, it doesn't matter because I can still achieve a fairly reasonable cycle, so that's what I went with. And you'll also notice that all these tripods that I'm using are level 4. Or at least the ones that matter. I don't have a last skill slotted in because that last skill, depending on the raid that you are fighting, differs. Sometimes it'll be a counter, sometimes it'll be Inferno, sometimes it'll be Seraphic Hail. So just to keep these tests consistent, I decided to omit them, and I'm going to omit them for every single DPS test that I do. I also won't be using my Awakening, except to proc the Nightmare set effect at the very beginning, just because that's standard, and so I have just the fast cast one. Okay, so with that, I am going to start this test with full identity gauge. The reason being is because if you look on the market right now, search for stimulants, you can see, at least on NA West, it's 23 gold. And in any serious raid encounter, most people will be popping a stimulant before they go in. If you're the kind of person that says, oh, that's unethical and unfair and biased towards Igniter, I'm a Reflux player, right? And I think it's fair for Igniter players to do this, so that's what I'm going to do. So I have the timer set for 2 minutes. I'm not going to do any pre-stacking or pre-casting. I'm just going to hit the button, mute the microphone, and see how I do. So let's go. Okay, so not the cleanest canceling on my end, but I mean, I think I did everything pretty properly, and I got a DPS of about 3.7 million. So in my extended testing when I was doing this kind of offline, I saw numbers anywhere between 3 million at the lowest end when pretty much nothing crit, and like 4 million when I had a really good RNG seed and I was critting a lot. But you can probably expect something kind of in the middle there. So a lot of people talk about, oh, well, you know, Igniter, you need to play it in a party with synergies, like crit synergies, so that you can crit more often. So what I like to do is simulate that. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to my stats and just add 300 crit, which is roughly equivalent to about 10% crit rate. So you'll see that my crit rate jumps from 27% to 37%, right, with the 10% additional, which is pretty standard for a crit synergy. So I want to see how much better Igniter does with the additional synergy added here. So once again, I'm going to start with full meter, and let's see how this goes. So with an additional 10% crit rate, you can see this time around I got about 3.8 million compared to 3.7. So you can see that, again, depending on how you crit and how well you do, you can see that Igniter does great burst damage, but the DPS is pretty on par, on the higher end definitely for sure. You might have noticed during that test that I didn't purposely use skills from time to time. That was because I was trying my hardest to make sure that for every single big spell, I was in the Magick Addiction state, so sometimes I hold it off on using Frost's Call so that I wouldn't accidentally slip into that state. Okay, so that's it for Igniter. Let's go ahead and test out Reflux. So I'll start with the standard version of Reflux, the most popular version as it were, which is just your instant cast. This is the Keen Blunt weapon variant, because I'm not using Doomsday or anything like that. So right off the bat, I'm just going to proc Nightmare. This one's going to run Crit and Swiftness. For the engravings, I'm going to go ahead and use Reflux, Grudge, Keen Blunt Weapon, Hitmaster, and Adrenaline. Go ahead and set up the Scarecrow. Okay. And so with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the build. Again, still using 6-set Nightmare here. This is Crit Swiftness, 64% crit rate. For the engravings, again as you saw before. The gems, again as you saw before, but this time we have Reverse Gravity and Seraphic Hail slotted in. And again, Lost Wind Cliff. For the skills, note here that I am using Unstable Rule over Rule Enhancement. Normally I would use Rule Enhancement, but when I set up these tripods a long time ago, I didn't have Rule Enhancement handy. I went with Unstable Rule. It doesn't really affect the build too much. Some people say that it makes a difference in staying in Boundless MP or not, but I find that unless you have very high CDR, you're gonna slip back into Magick Addiction eventually anyway, so it's a little bit more realistic in that sense. And as before, everything is level 4. There's my skill distribution on the left, and here are my runes on the right. Some people ask me why I don't put max skills into Punishing Strike. They say, isn't it one of our strongest skills? Well, in one go, it is, but overall its DPS is actually fairly low. Just its cooldown to damage ratio is not that great, and for this reason, it's not a great DPS skill. Okay, so as before, again, no stacking, no awakening, nothing like that. I am just going to hit the boss for 2 minutes, and let's see how we do. Okay, so with that, I got a DPS of about 3.7 million, which is about on par with my testing. So you can see that in terms of like DPS, it looks like Reflux and Igniter do, fairly similar amounts of damage, which kind of surprised me. Maybe my Igniter setup wasn't optimal or something like that. So if you see a problem with my Igniter setup and maybe there's something I could have done better, please leave a comment down below. And if I think it's worth trying, I'll try it out. Okay, so the next build I'm going to try is the Swiftness variant of this. So for that, we're just going to swap around the crit and the Swiftness. For the engravings, we're going to replace Keen Blunt Weapon with Raid Captain. If I could find it. It is. For the sets, I'm gonna go ahead and change it up. A lot of people say to use 2 Dominion for Nightmare, and even though 6 Nightmare is still the predominantly, superior set, I'm gonna go ahead and use this one instead. So let's see, let's go ahead and change just 2 of these pieces to the Dominion set, which will give me that Inner Awakening. Okay, conversion applied, so let's go ahead and double check that. There is the 2 set Dominion, and there is the 4 set Nightmare. So everything as is, I'm going to be using the basic same skill set, right? Just to not complicate things. I will, however, change some tripods because if you just spam as hard as you can during the test, you're gonna run out of mana. I have found that just changing Punishing Strikes to Mind Enhancement still keeps you in that boundless MP state, but makes it so that you're not actively running out of mana. The other thing I'm going to change is I'm going to use Invisca's Might. This is more of a Trixion thing because I can start the test immediately without factoring the Awakening damage in so that I can start the test. As before, I'm just going to Awakening, start the test, and hit the boss, and we'll go from there. Okay, so for this one, I got a DPS of about 4 million. Note that this is a little bit inflated for a couple of reasons. The first one being that my Awakening still hasn't come off cooldown. So in a real raid, you're not going to have full uptime on this buff. And so because of that, the DPS should be slightly lower. And this build, of course, requires you to essentially stick to the boss and land all of your abilities consistently. In bosses that have, bigger gaps between the two, then your DPS is going to, of course, get lower, while the burst classes will get higher, right? In any case, though, I think it basically evens out in the end. So let's go ahead and test out what the cooldown of my awakening is once I drop into the boundless MP state. I think that'd be kind of interesting to see. Let me go ahead and just proc boundless MP here. 5 in boundless MP. Let's go ahead and awakening. And it's about 2 minutes, as you can see here. It would say 1 minute if it was exactly that, so it's slightly over 2 minutes, so you can actually get, close to 100% uptime. You just have to cast your awakening off cooldown. And for that reason, a lot of people in Korea actually prefer just using the standard 6 Nightmare because they can't be bothered to cast this. Alright, the last build that I'm going to test out, I guess no, not the last build, the second to last build is going to be the hybrid version of this instant cast that puts in Doomsday instead. Now this build does occasionally take Final Strike tripods, but I don't have enough pages to support that, so this will be the Keen Blunt Weapon version, so please forgive me for that. But I've done a test before, and many people have remarked before that the two builds are essentially the same. The Final Strike build will have slightly higher highs and lower lows, while this build is a little bit more consistent. So let's go ahead and go into the training room and let's do our setup. Again, 1600 crit, 500 swiftness. Go ahead and do our engravings, reflux, grudge, keen blunt weapon. Let's go ahead and do Hitmaster and Adrenaline. Go ahead and summon our boss. Am I in 6 Nightmare still? No, I'm in Dominion, so I have to do a conversion. So this time around, I want to go back to 6 Nightmare. There we go. So I am 6 Nightmare again, so I can go ahead and awaken. Go ahead and summon the boss. Set up the timer. Oh, there we go. Let's go ahead and look at the build. 1600 crit, 500 swiftness. Again, it's basically the exact same setup as before. The only difference here is that I have Doomsday gems slotted in, and I took away a cooldown gem from Punishing Strike and put it on Blaze, just as this build has a little bit more trouble maintaining Adrenaline, so having a lower cooldown Blaze helps a little bit with that. Cards, nothing as well. For the skills, let's go ahead and go through them really quickly. Again, normally I'd use Rule Enhancement. And again, all level 4, as you can see. There are my gems, runes on the side, and my skill distribution on the left. Okay, so just as before, I'm gonna go ahead and just hit the boss for 2 minutes, mute my microphone, and see how we do. Okay, so with this build, I got about 3.8 million DPS. That's a little bit higher than what I usually parse with this build. It's usually closer to like 3.75. In any event, it's very similar to the other, variants of instant cast, whether it's standard or the Swiftness. This one just mixes in Doomsday, which is a personal favorite of mine, and a lot of Korean players also do that as well, if you checked my last video. Okay, moving on to the final Reflux build, which is going to be the casting build. Let's go ahead and leave, and let's go ahead and swap our setup. I'm gonna go ahead and just instantly proc the Nightmare set effect. 1600 crits and 500 swiftness. For the engravings, we're going to use Reflux, Grudge, Hitmaster, Precision Dagger, and All Out Attack, because this one is running Final Strike tripods. I'm gonna go ahead and summon a boss. Set the timer to 2 minutes. Let's go ahead and take a look at the build. Again, 6 Nightmare with Swiftness, 84% crit rates due to Precision Dagger. There are the engravings. The gems are the same as the Igniter build essentially. You can see Explosion there. For the skills, let's go ahead and go through them. You can see I'm using Final Strike now. Now for this one, some people have mentioned that just like Igniter, you should try to stay within the magic amplification or addiction state when you're bursting. I have found in practice that's very hard to do on a casting build because of the additional cooldown and swiftness. So I'm going to do 2 attempts. I'm going to try just casting my skills off cooldown, and I'm going to try setting my resources to infinity in the Trixian settings to see what it would be like if you were just constantly in Magick Addiction. And again, all level 4. Alright, let's go ahead and give this a go. Okay, so with this setup, I got a DPS of about 2.8 million. This is definitely on the lower end. I usually get around 3 to 3.2 million. Um, I think it was because I was trying my best to stay in the magic amplification state when all my things held, so maybe that just naturally dropped my DPS. So now what I want to try and do is, as you've mentioned before, in a world where you have access to MP food and bards and things like that, and you don't drop below that state, how does the build perform? So I'm going to click on this unlimited resource, which essentially means I will always be in the Magick Addiction state, and let's see how the DPS does, shall we? Okay, so in a world where you can constantly stay in the Magick Addiction state, then you can see that the DPS is about 3.3 million. I've mentioned this before, I'll say it one more time. In Trixian, casting is oftentimes going to score a lower DPS compared to the other builds, just by nature of how the build works. You're just a more bursty class, and in those raids where you have those small windows to attack, then the casting build might be slightly better. So a lot of people then will compare this casting build to Igniter and say, why not just play Igniter, right? When you can, do this big casting setup and locking yourself with these long animations and things like that. And that's just personal preference, right? This gives you access to Blink, which is a huge benefit, right? You don't have to wait for, support synergy or burst. Although it's still recommended, right? You can pretty much just cast your skills at will, and it offers greater freedom than the Igniter build. So what I'd like to end this video with is one more look at the Igniter build, just to get another cycle in, just for the people who say, oh, well, this means that Igniter sucks or whatever. So I'll do one more parse just to, kind of squash that debate. So let's go ahead and leave. Let's go ahead and go back to Igniter. Again, I'm gonna use the same setup that I did before. Not gonna do the one with synergy this time. Hitmaster, size dagger. Finally, let's go ahead and slot in all. Go ahead and set the timer. Again, I didn't change anything about the build. There it is, right? Again, I'm aware that it's not the perfect igniter setup, but I think this is reasonable enough to do a comparison with. Again, gonna start with full identity, hit the boss for 2 minutes, and let's give it a go. Okay, I did mess up at the end there. With my last Doomsday, I accidentally moved into Boundless MP, but it was just one Doomsday and it didn't even crit anyway. So again, as I've said before, this build ranges from 3 mil to 4 mil, depending on how well you crit. So let's do one last test to wrap up the video with a crit synergy. I'm gonna add in 300 crits. Again, bringing us to 37, and this time I'll try my hardest not to accidentally slip into Boundless MP. When you do so many tests back to back, you're bound to make some mistakes. So again, starting at full identity, let's go. As I've mentioned before, this build will range between 3 and 4 million, and definitely on its higher end, it is by far the strongest Reflux build, right? Because again, a lot of bosses with support synergies, things like Bard Serenade and those big burst buffs, you're gonna naturally do more damage in a raid. Now, I didn't make this video to prove a point or to say which build is better. I mainly put out this video just to show you what it looks like when you have a reasonable setup for each build and do a comparison. I know a lot of you out there, don't have the setup to test everything, and the Trixian update with all of these setups can't come fast enough. So in the meantime, you'll have to do with this video here. So at the end of the day, I've said this like 1,000 times, but play whatever you want. I personally find Igniter to actually be a lot of fun, and this is coming from a guy who plays Reflux, right, for the entire cycle of Lost Ark's duration here in the West. Ideally, one day I would love to set up a full Igniter build in the actual game with the accessories and all of that stuff, so that I could switch based on my mood and feeling. So with that, hope you enjoyed, and take care.